Hi, this is a short video about ethnic inequality. So there's a couple of main things that we need to look at. Firstly, we need to look at classifications of race and ethnicity. What are the categories and what do they mean and how are they defined? We need to look at the evidence on ethnic inequality, which covers issues like the workplace, education and the media. We need to look at the perspectives in sociology, which have different explanations of why there is ethnic inequality and how things are changing. So firstly, in answering an essay question on ethnic inequality, so if it says something like outline and assess sociological explanations of ethnic inequality or patterns of ethnic inequality, you need to recognise first of all what ethnic inequality means. So race refers to the idea of biological differences between groups of human beings. So for example, white people being seen as less intelligent than Asian people because biologically they inherit different characteristics in terms of intelligence and level of intelligence. This is part of what we call a colonial system of race, which means back during times of colonialization and empire building before the Second World War, there was a lot of emphasis on race to justify the idea of the enslavement of certain groups by other groups. Ethnicity is a different term, but it includes the idea of biological differences, which may include differences such as skin colour, as a marker of difference. But ethnicity mainly focuses on the idea of cultural differences between ethnic groups, between groups of people. So it assumes that there are different groups of people who have different cultures, such as the difference between white British culture and Pakistani culture. Now, racism. Racism is to do with different treatment of groups of people based on the idea of race. So for example, treating people differently because they're Asian compared to how people from white British backgrounds are treated. So for example, giving Asians more responsibility in the workplace would be evidence that might be justified by the idea of intelligence being different for Asians. But it's also can be cultural. So there's biological racism where we treat people differently because we assume they're different biologically. But there could also be cultural racism where we assume people are different culturally and that one culture is superior or better and another culture is inferior or worse. So this could be supported by theorists like Edward Said, who says that we live in post-colonial times but we still have the cultural conditions of colonialism. In other words, although we no longer try to build empires where one race is seen as better, we still have the idea that one race is better, and so this still affects the employment of different groups in the workplace and so on. It might affect the decisions that employers make, where they choose not to employ someone because they're black or so on. Then we've got the idea of institutional racism and individual racism. So individual racism will be where a person as an individual is racist, perhaps because of their individual beliefs about race and the ability of certain groups to do certain jobs. But then that could be an individual employer. But institutional racism is saying the problem is worse than just an individual or individuals, that the whole system is bad or racist and treats people differently as a whole system, as a whole process. So for example, in the workplace, where people are systematically not given jobs because they're black or Asian, in terms of crime and deviance, where Stephen Lawrence was considered to be an offender, even though he was a victim, the police assumed he was an offender, where the police systematically, on a normal everyday basis, are stopping and searching more black and Asian people, not because of the level of criminality, but because of the race of the groups. So then we have the concepts of data or evidence within each institution. So what I would try to do is probably combine this with the theories. So you can consider each area, like work, education, crime, media and politics, but I would probably consider each theory in perspective and look at what they might say about that. So for example, we could take work and we could talk about the difference in the market and work situation of different groups. We could consider the concept of issues like ethnic penalty, where Asians and black African Caribbean groups are paid less, even though they might have similar levels of experience and qualifications. And then we could explain this with the functionalists. We could say this is something that will disappear over time with assimilation. The Marxists might say this is a permanent problem because of capitalism, and therefore we need to remove capitalism. The Weberians might say it's a special issue because of race, which is to do with status, and therefore it's separate from capitalism, but it is a problem where some groups are prevented from accessing certain areas, which is the issue of social closure, and that's a process which keeps on happening and therefore needs to be challenged. The neo-Marxists, what would they say? They talk about racialized parts of the class structure, so they'd say yes, it is an economic issue to do with capitalism, but they'd be different from traditional Marxists, and they'd say that ethnicity and race is a factor which is not just linked to the class system. It's not just because of capitalism, it's also a special issue on its own, similar to what Weberians say. Other neo-Marxists have focused on how there's scapegoating, so you can look at how the media plays a role in promoting certain views of certain groups to keep them in their place. And then the postmodernists would talk about fragmentation and the destabilization of identities. So the way I'd structure the essay essentially is to take each area of inequality, like evidence, and then try and apply the theories to it. So, the functionists might say, yes, it's not meritocratic when there is a difference in the jobs of people in the workplace based on their ethnicity. But then they might say, well, this is probably to do with a lack of assimilation, but this will disappear over time because those groups will assimilate into the main culture, and then they'll be competing for jobs in the economy, and then they'll be moving up the class system and achieving social mobility. There'll be so this is something that will disappear over time, although it is a problem. The Marxists would criticize this and say this is a permanent problem due to capitalism. Racism serves capitalism because it keeps the working class divided and prevents them from achieving class consciousness, and therefore the functionists probably overplay meritocracy and they underplay power and exploitation. The neo-Marxists and Weberians have a similar view in the sense that they argue that race is a particular special issue, but the Weberians would criticize the neo-Marxists for underplaying the particular issue of race and overplaying the economic aspect of capitalism, because they still come back to capitalism as the part of the reason for race and racism. The postmodernists would criticize these other theorists for overemphasizing the stability of race identities and status, and they point out that there's a lot of choice, there's more individualization, so ethnic groups are able to achieve identities which are separate from work and more based on culture and consumption. And they'd also point out about the destabilization of identities due to superdiversity. So the idea that there's this kind of fragmented groups, it's no longer possible to point to certain groups as experiencing issues more than others. There's just difference in the kind of issues they experience. And also the issues are not simply due to race. The postmodernists would emphasize intersectionality. So intersectionality refers to the issue of all the factors combining. That means class, age, gender and ethnicity all play a part in creating someone's particular individual experience of inequality. So it would be insufficient to blame race, and it would be more important to look at the range of factors which influence someone's experience of inequality. The interactionists and postmodernists are also interested in narratives in the media, for example, the issue of moral panics and labelling. The interactionists would say these are important in reinforcing inequality and creating disadvantage for some groups. But the postmodernists might say that it's not possible anymore to achieve a consensus about groups being a problem, and therefore there's probably more competing narratives about ethnic groups, which no longer, is no longer any agreement about which group is best or worse. So it's a more complex, divided world in which there is the possibility of equality, but there's still this tension between traditional views and the views of choice, equality, and rights. Different sociologists have different views about that. There is postmodernist Marxist influenced thinkers like Jameson who still argue that globalization is destructive and it's harmful and it's still based on narratives about race which tend to disempower certain groups and empower others. This is a more critical view. And then you've got other thinkers like Giddens who might be more optimistic about choice and the kind of flexibility of status in a more globalized world. I hope that helps with the structure. There's an image which I've got here which we can have a look at, which just shows in terms of changes. If we look at before World War II and then we look at after World War II, we can see that there are several types of changes. So we can refer to the spec changes, which is social changes in terms of groups, where social groups like ethnic minority groups have got more status, and there's the concept of equal rights and citizenship. Obviously the different theorists will disagree over to the extent to which this has actually been arrived at in terms of equality and citizenship. But the functionists like Parsons would say citizenship provides the possibility of equality for ethnic groups. Social institutions have changed, so the institution of education has widened access to education, and that means that ethnic groups can move up the ladder based on the principle of meritocracy. But you can see the evidence for ethnic inequality in the education system when there's differential educational attainment. And this suggests that there are still problems due to views about race. For example, racist teachers. For example, a study by Wright about racist teachers in the class system, and that was back in the 80s, so not too long ago. There's still division and inequality in the education system, which suggests that those views in our culture are still affecting status of groups in our structure. Politically, society has changed. We've gone from a more monocultural and politically disempowered groups to a more multicultural, politically empowered groups in principle. That's the idea. So we've gone from a system where some groups have got more power, like white British, to a system where there's the idea of democracy and openness in the political system, so any group can influence power. However, that's debatable. Depends on the perspective that you're applying. Economically, there's been a widening of service sector jobs, which many ethnic minority groups have gone into, and economically the knowledge economy, so again the idea of it's what you know rather than who you know, which suggests again a more open society. But again, the theorists differ on this. You find a larger proportion still in the economy of black and minority ethnic groups in the cleaning and 0 hours contracts in the economy, and you'll still find white British middle class in the top jobs. So there's still inequality there, and again the perspectives will discuss this in different ways. Culturally, you can say we've gone from monoculturalism to multiculturalism, from rigid systems of duty-based culture to more flexible systems of choice and individualization. So culturally, you can say there's the possibility of destabilizing or destroying the old race-based ideas in our culture, but those norms and values still persist, and there's still a great deal of fear and desire in the cultural system. For example, if you look at the latest issues with the Rotherham report, you can see that there's this fear of the other, this fear of groups who present a threat, because the Pakistani offenders and the white female victims came from probably similar, perhaps similar class backgrounds, but different ethnic backgrounds, and that's something that the media has played up upon and picked up on. It's also a concern because the authorities like the police and social services were fearful of being accused of racism. So you can see that there's this constant issue of race which creates problems, whether it's where people are being exploited, or where people are being exploited because of the fear of being accused of racism, which makes it a more complex world. The last thing I want to mention is that postmodernists would say that with the destabilization of identities and roles and culture, there is this sense of fragmentation, but there's still a debate over that. So you've got the idea of binary oppositions, where white is divided from the other non-white groups, and then they have these different qualities of civilized, uncivilized, superior, inferior, and so on. But then there's the argument that there's a deconstruction of these identities, and they can no longer be a consensus about those groups being a threat or a problem, and so people just tend to look at actions rather than what someone is. It's who they are, and that's under debate still. In a contemporary world where we still have a white British middle class background Prime Minister, we still have a credit system which still continues to benefit the banks, and we still have a system where white bankers are in the majority. You could argue that globally we're seeing a great deal of evidence that groups are benefiting from this inequality system in a minority, but the debate continues, so it really depends on which side you think the evidence lies.